Hello, this is Professor Scott Applegate. Welcome to PSCS 6248, Introduction to Cyber Conflict. This is Unit 4, Lesson 1, A Brief History of Cyber Conflict. Agenda. In this lesson, we will cover a brief overview of the most significant events of the last 30 years in the emerging domain of cyber conflict. We will then discuss the three major lessons learned from this high-level review and attempt to ascertain what the future holds in this domain. Introduction. As young second lieutenants first enter the United States Army, they often find themselves studying and analyzing the battles of the American Civil War. As these officers continue their professional education throughout their military careers, they return often to studying the key battles of the past. These battles are studied to learn and integrate tactical, operational, and strategic lessons. Although these battles took place more than a century ago, these lessons are often still relevant today in terms of leadership and other attributes. To date, this type of learning has not been applied to the domain of cyber conflict. This lesson is the first step in applying this type of learning to this domain. This lesson will briefly lay out the history of cyber conflict from 1970 through the present. This will be a short review as we will look at a number of these events in greater detail over the course of the next few weeks. Key events are highlighted on the timeline, focusing on events or activities that set precedents, led to policy changes, or led to the establishment of new organizations. Events are presented in historical order. However, some of these events span several years. Only the initial date of such events are shown. Finally, we will look at the three major lessons we can derive from a general study of the history of cyber conflict. A brief history of cyber conflict. We will start our look at the history of cyber conflict with the release of the Security Controls for Computer Systems, report of the Defense Science Board Task Force on Computer Security, also known as the Ware Report, in 1970. The Ware Report was released by the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, now called DARPA, to deal with the risks associated with the rapid growth of multi-access, resource-sharing computer systems, the primordial network ooze from which the Internet would be born. Ware and his co-authors outline what remain to this day the most common vulnerabilities of computer networks. The report included a list of conclusions and recommendations that, based on the history of the last 47 years, many have failed to take to heart. The report noted that a combination of hardware, software, communication, physical, personnel, and administrative procedural safeguards is required for comprehensive security. In particular, software safeguards alone are not sufficient. The Ware Report with minor edits could be released today and would be totally relevant. Healy calls the period from 1980 through the early 90s realization. In 1986, an event took place at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory that has come to be known as the Cuckoo's Egg. This event marks the first recognizable example of a cyber conflict event and state-sponsored cyber espionage. We will look at this event in more depth as a case study later in the course, as it is a seminal event in the history of both cyber conflict and cybersecurity. In 1988, Robert Tappan Morris created and released a piece of malware now called the Morris worm. Morris ostensibly created this worm to map the nascent Internet, but it rapidly infected more than 6,000 Unix systems, or around 10% of the Internet at that point in time. It took up to 2 days to clean a single computer, and the worm paralyzed a good percentage of the Internet. This led to the formation of the first computer emergency response team at Carnegie Mellon University under U.S. government contract. It has also resulted in the first felony conviction in the U.S. under the 1986 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. After appeals, Morris was sentenced to 3 years probation, 400 hours of community service, and a fine of $10,000 plus the cost of his supervision. In 1990, we see the first known breach of U.S. military computer networks by Dutch hackers. In 1995, the United States established the 609th Information Warfare Squadron, the first offensive-defensive cyber combat unit in the world. This same year, we also see the first large-scale attack by a hacktivist group with the Strano network denial of service attacks. An Italian political collective called the Strano Network implemented the now infamous net strike against various French government websites in protest against nuclear policies. These attacks would foreshadow many events to come and demonstrate the potential of hacktivism. Also in 1995, Vladimir Levin, a Russian computer administrator, and a group of his accomplices transferred $10.7 million from Citibank to accounts held by his accomplices using vulnerabilities to the X.25 networks the bank was using at the time. Levin's success led to Citibank appointing the first Chief Information Security Officer, a position which has become relatively standard in major corporations. In 1998, Levin was tried in the U.S. and sentenced to 3 years in jail and ordered to make restitution of $240,000. Citibank claimed that all but $400,000 of the stolen $10.7 million had been recovered. In 1997, the United States conducted a military exercise called Eligible Receiver. Eligible Receiver was a red team exercise with hackers emulating adversary activities attempting to break into U.S. networks and systems. This exercise highlighted numerous vulnerabilities to U.S. networks. This same year, President Clinton signed Executive Order 13010, which addressed concerns regarding infrastructure by listing critical infrastructures, identifying threats to critical infrastructures, and establishing the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection. "1998 was a busy year in the history of cyber conflict and begins the period Healy calls takeoff. An intrusion called Solar Sunrise confirmed many of the findings of the Eligible Receiver exercise. The breach was originally thought to be the work of a state actor, but turned out to be the work of 3 teenage hackers, 2 of which were still in high school in California. This event led the military to the conclusion that it needed better synchronization for investigating and coordinating computer network defenses. Later this year, the U.S. military established the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense, JTF-C&D, the first joint warfighting cyber command in the U.S. military and the direct ancestor of today's United States Cyber Command. 2 other significant events in 1998 were the Moonlight Maze intrusions and the EDT floodnet attacks. Moonlight Maze was the FBI inquiry into the first large-scale cyber espionage campaign against the United States government networks. It is one of the earliest examples of what is typically called an advanced persistent threat today. The Electronic Disturbance Theater created a program to allow electronic civil disobedience called FloodNet, which would help create the simulation of a sit-in protest over the internet, simply known as a virtual sit-in demonstration, to demonstrate non-violent resistance in support of the Zapatista rebels residing in the state of Chiapas, Mexico. Some at the time tried to liken the event to electronic or cyber terrorism. However, it remains in the realm of hacktivism or political hacking and does not really qualify as a terrorist event in either spirit or deed. Finally, President Clinton signed Presidential Decision Directive 63, PDD 63, in 1998, the first presidential strategy on critical infrastructure protection and cybersecurity. PDD 63 also established the National Infrastructure Protection Center. PDD 63 is still in effect today. In 1999, David L. Smith released the Melissa virus, a mass mailing macrovirus which is estimated to have caused $80 million in damages to government and business computer systems and networks. Smith was arrested, pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to 10 years, serving 20 months, and fined $5,000. The arrest was the result of a collaborative effort involving, amongst others, the FBI, the New Jersey State Police, Monmouth Internet, and a Swedish computer scientist. During that same year, Operation Allied Force spurred 2 examples of patriotic hacking. Patriotic hackers, mostly from Yugoslavia and Russia, attacked U.S. and NATO networks to express their displeasure with Allied operations in Yugoslavia. They were joined by Chinese hackers later that year after the U.S. accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. In 2001, the NIMDA worm, NIMDA being admin spelled backwards, became the fastest spreading malware on the internet, infecting millions of computers in just 22 minutes. The worm used multiple self-propagating methods of infection. Some text in the coding of the malware suggests it may have originated in China. Also in 2001, the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense reflagged to become the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Operations, adding offensive operations to its mission. 2003 begins the period Jay Healy calls militarization. 2003 started with a bang as the SQL slammer worm infected some 75,000 systems in under 10 minutes. Although titled SQL slammer worm, the malware did not use the SQL language. It exploited a buffer overflow bug in Microsoft's flagship SQL Server and Desktop Engine database products, for which there had been a patch released some 6 months earlier. The worm caused a denial of service on some internet hosts and dramatically slowed down general internet traffic. In 2003, the Department of Homeland Security was established and incorporated the National Infrastructure Protection Center and other cyber operations. It would eventually be designated as the lead federal agency for cyber incident response actions within the United States. That same year, President Bush signed Homeland Security Presidential Directive 7, or HSPD 7, a national policy for federal departments and agencies to identify and prioritize critical infrastructure and to protect them from terrorist attacks. The directive defined relevant terms and delivered 31 policy statements. These policy statements define what the directive covers and the roles of various federal, state, and local agencies will play in carrying it out. Also in 2003, the National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace was drafted by the Department of Homeland Security in reaction to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Released on February 14, 2003, it offers suggestions, but not mandates, to business, academic, and individual users of cyberspace to secure computer systems and networks. In 2004, the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Operations, JTF-CNO, reflags again, this time as the Joint Task Force for Global Network Operations, JTF-GNO, as it added command authority for network management to its mission and continued its evolution as a joint warfighting command responsible for all aspects of cyberspace operations in the U.S. military. In 2005, the U.S. military established the Joint Functional Component Command for Network Warfare, or JFCCNW, as a subordinate command of the United States Strategic Command handling offensive cyberspace operations. In 2008, JFCCNW would assume operational control of Joint Task Force Global Network Operations, and in 2010, both would be subsumed by the establishment of the United States Cyber Command. This year also saw the discovery of Titan Rain, a long-term cyber espionage campaign thought to be of Chinese origin, which had been ongoing for at least 3 years at the time of its discovery. This campaign compromised sensitive targets such as Lockheed Martin, Sandia National Laboratory, Redstone Arsenal, and NASA. In 2007, the country of Estonia was subjected to several weeks of distributed denial-of-service attacks and web defacements by Russian patriotic hackers. Many theorize these attacks were covertly instigated by the Russian government. Also this same year, the Israelis undertake Operation Orchid, an airstrike on a suspected reactor in the Deir el-Zor region of Syria. Israel reportedly used cyber operations in conjunction with the raid to take over Syrian air defenses and feed them a false air picture for the entire period of time the Israeli fighter jets needed to cross Syria, bomb their target, and return. In 2008, in conjunction with the physical invasion of Georgia, Russian patriotic hackers subjected the country of Georgia to distributed denial-of-service attacks and web defacements during the South Ossetia War. Evidence suggests that not only did the Russian government covertly instigate the attacks, but that there was also direct participation. That same year, the Configure worm infected millions of computers, including government, business, and home computers in over 190 countries, making it the largest known computer worm infection since the 2003 Welchia worm. The virulence of this worm led to the foundation of the Configure Working Group, the first truly successful collaboration between governments and private sector to deal with such a threat. In 2008, Classified military computers in the United States Central Command were infected with a worm which has since been codenamed Buckshot Yankee. This is the first publicly known intrusion to U.S. classified networks and would eventually lead to the establishment of the United States Cyber Command. In 2009, researchers at the Information Warfare Monitor discovered a new cyber espionage campaign they called GhostNet. GhostNet compromised systems in 103 countries, including computer systems belonging to embassies, foreign ministries, and other government offices, and the Dalai Lama's Tibetan exile centers in India, London, and New York City. In 2010, Google released information that Chinese hackers had targeted the company in a series of cyber espionage intrusions called Operation Aurora. Unlike previous victims of Chinese cyber espionage, Google undertook a secret counteroffensive and actually hacked back into Chinese servers to gather evidence of the activity. During its investigation, Google determined the Chinese had compromised at least 33 other companies. This marked the first time a private corporation, the victim of a cyber intrusion, had hacked back against a state actor. 2010 also saw the discovery of Stuxnet, the first known kinetic cyber attack by a state actor. Discovered by virus block ADA, Stuxnet is suspected to be the work of the United States and Israel, and has been linked to a U.S. operation called Olympic Games by journalist David Sanger. Finally, as a result of the Buckshot Yankee compromise, the United States established U.S. Cyber Command in 2010 as a sub-unified combatant command under United States Strategic Command. U.S. Cyber Command absorbed both JTF-GNO and JFCC-NW as it was established. Its commander was also dual-hatted as the director of the National Security Agency. In 2011, 2 additional pieces of sophisticated malware were discovered which are both believed to be either related to or based on the Stuxnet malware. The Duku worm is an information gathering worm which is believed to have been created by the same authors as Stuxnet, or by someone who had access to the Stuxnet code. Duku looks for information that could be useful in attacking industrial control systems. Gauss is a banking Trojan which also appears to be related to or built off the same technology as Stuxnet and Flame. Although Gauss was discovered before Flame, it is likely that Flame was created before Gauss, as Gauss appears to be based on the Flame malware platform. Gauss is a complex cyber espionage toolkit. It is highly modular and supports new functions which can be deployed remotely by the operators in the form of plugins. Flame was discovered in 2012 and is considered the most sophisticated malware yet discovered in the wild. It was likely deployed in 2010 and, like Stuxnet, Duku, and Gauss, is a modular platform capable of carrying a number of different payloads. Shamoon is another modular cyber espionage toolkit discovered in 2012 that was targeting gas and oil companies in the Middle East. Some have speculated this malware is also related to the Olympic Games suite of malware, while others speculate it may have been created by Iran after analysis of the Stuxnet malware. In 2013, Mandiant, an American cybersecurity firm, released an in-depth report attributing cyber espionage activity to a specific unit of the People's Liberation Army of China. The report featured highly credible evidence, including names of individuals and investigative intrusions or hackbacks onto PLA machines that were conducting cyber espionage against American private companies. The Mandiant report contributed to the evidence used in indictments against 5 Chinese military hackers in 2014 for computer hacking and economic espionage directed against 6 American entities in the U.S. nuclear power, metals, and solar products industries. It was also very likely a contributing factor to the agreement reached between President Xi Jinping and President Barack Obama in 2015. The most spectacular story in 2013 related to cyber conflict was undoubtedly leaks by former NSA contractor Edward Snowden related to the United States government's global surveillance programs run by the NSA and its Five Eyes allies. Regardless of whether you regard Snowden as a hero or a traitor, his leaks sparked a fierce debate in the United States on privacy and warrantless domestic surveillance.
The leaks indisputably damaged the United States intelligence efforts and created tensions between the U.S. and some of its closest allies. Snowden fled the U.S. and eventually ended up in Moscow, where he remains a controversial figure to this day. In 2014, a group calling themselves the Guardians of Peace, most likely linked to the North Korean government, breached Sony Picture Entertainment's corporate networks in response to the pending release of a film called The Interview, a comedy about a plot to assassinate North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The group leaked personal information about Sony Pictures employees and their families, emails between employees, information about executive salaries at the company, copies of then unreleased Sony films, and other information. They also threatened terrorist attacks at cinemas screening the film. After major U.S. cinema chains opted not to screen the film in response to these threats, Sony elected to cancel the film's former premiere and mainstream release, opting to skip directly to a digital release followed by a limited theatrical release the next day. That same year, Kaspersky Labs discovered new malware called Regan, a sophisticated malware toolkit. The malware targets specific users of Microsoft Windows-based computers and has been linked to U.S. intelligence gathering agency NSA and its British counterpart, the GCHQ. 2015 saw one of the most spectacular and successful cyber espionage incidents in history with the breach of the United States Office of Personnel Management. Hackers, suspected to be from the People's Liberation Army of China, managed to break into the OPM personnel database that hosts background records for millions of security clearance investigations. This intrusion exposed more than 21 million personnel records, almost all related to individuals who had applied for or been awarded high-level security clearances. During the same year, suspected Russian hackers managed to break into an unclassified network for the U.S. military's Joint Staff at the Pentagon using a phishing attack. As a result of this intrusion, the entire Joint Staff network was disconnected from the military's other networks for several weeks, while network defenders rooted the adversaries out of the networks. In Ukraine, suspected Russian hackers struck again, breaking into the Ukrainian power grid, causing unscheduled power outages to a large number of customers. Black energy malware was discovered on the compromised systems. However, it is unknown what role this malware played in the event. A similar attack took place a year later in 2016, blacking out approximately 1.4 million residents in the Ivano-Frankivsk region of Ukraine. Finally, in 2015, Kaspersky Labs blogged that it had been the victim of a state-sponsored intrusion, which it tentatively attributed to the U.S. Malware believed to be related to Stuxnet and Duku was used to gather information on Kaspersky's investigations into nation-state hacking. During a state visit in September 2015, President Xi Jinping of China and President Barack Obama reached a cyber agreement that neither country would knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property for commercial gain. Also of note in 2015, the United Nations group of governmental experts on developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security published its third consensus report. This report included 11 recommendations for non-binding norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. These recommendations represent an important step forward in codifying the emerging norms in this domain. In 2016 saw two breaches of historic significance. In the first, an investigation into intrusions at Yahoo revealed a data breach dating back to 2014, exposing credentials and data on more than 500 million users. Yahoo has publicly stated that the breach was instigated by a nation-state. Yahoo had to force a password reset on all of its customers in response to the breach. In March of the following year, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted 2 Russian intelligence agents and 2 criminal hackers over the incident. Yahoo's troubles continue to mount when in December of 2016, Yahoo revealed a second breach dating back to August of 2013 that compromised 1 billion user accounts. Compromised data included usernames, email addresses, phone numbers, dates of birth, passwords, and security questions and answers. The data was posted for sale for $200,000 or best offer on underground forums. Yahoo later updated the previous projections of 1 billion accounts affected, acknowledging that all 3 billion accounts were compromised. Also in 2016, a hacker identified as Guccifer and other individuals with suspected ties to Russia hacked the Democratic National Committee and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton's personal email server and publicly released selected information through WikiLeaks. U.S. intelligence agencies released analysis in early 2017 stating that they had investigated these and other actions and concluded that there was evidence to show that Russia had orchestrated these intrusions and leaks with the intent to damage the Clinton campaign and assist the Trump campaign. In addition to the breaches and leaked information, there is also evidence that Russia sponsored cells of trolls to flood social media with negative information focused on the Clinton campaign. While it is certainly debatable whether these efforts swayed the outcome of the election, the mere attempt by a foreign power to influence sovereign U.S. election processes is very troubling. As a result of the initial investigation, the Obama administration expelled 35 Russian diplomats in 2017 and imposed economic sanctions on some Russian individuals as well. Investigations into these efforts continues to this day. In June of 2016, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, formally recognized cyberspace as a domain of military operations. This indicates that NATO expects cyberspace to be a domain of conflict and will add cyberspace to its planning models for operations in the future. In August, a hacker group known as the Shadow Brokers published several leaks containing hacking tools purportedly stolen from the National Security Agency's Equation Group, which has been tied to the NSA's Tailored Access Operations Unit. The leaks contain numerous tools and zero-day exploits, the most notable of which, Eternal Blue, was used the following year in the WannaCry ransomware attack. In December 2016, Ukraine's power grid comes under attack again. A cyber attack targeted Ukraine's national power company, Ukrenergo, and shut down power to northern Kiev for over an hour. In March of 2017, WikiLeaks released 8,761 documents focused mainly on techniques for hacking and surveillance, and revealed how the CIA cooperated with British intelligence to engineer ways to compromise smart televisions, turning them into improvised spying devices. The documents appear fairly recent, covering 2013 to 2016, and also included information on hacking smartphones and computers. In May, thousands of email and other documents from the campaign of French President-elect Emmanuel Macron, totaling 9 gigabytes, were released shortly before the election. These leaks appear to be another in a continued campaign of cyber-enabled information operations linked to Russia and focused on influencing and discrediting Western elections. Ransomware took the spotlight in 2017 with a number of highly visible and massively scaled ransomware campaigns. The most notable was WannaCry, a ransomware campaign that spread across 99 countries using a vulnerability revealed in the Shadow Brokers leak of NSA tools. WannaCry targeted computers running the Microsoft Windows operating system by encrypting data and demanding ransom payments in the Bitcoin cryptocurrency. In December, the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia formally asserted that North Korea was behind the attack in its continuing efforts to illicitly acquire funds for the regime. And in September of 2018, the U.S. Department of Justice announced the indictment of Park Jin-hyuk, a North Korean hacker allegedly involved in the 2014 Sony hack, the 2016 theft of $81 million from a Bangladeshi bank, and the WannaCry ransomware attacks. In June of 2017, malware made to resemble the Petya ransomware, first discovered in 2016, was used in a global cyber attack. Unlike Petya, the NotPetya malware was modified so that it could not decrypt the data it was holding hostage. Like WannaCry, NotPetya used the Eternal Blue exploit linked by the Shadow Brokers. Although 80% of the NotPetya targets were in Ukraine, the malware had a significant impact worldwide. For example, shutting down the port terminals of Danish shipping giant Maersk for 2 days, causing an estimated $300 million in associated costs just to this one company. In February of 2018, the US and UK formally blamed Russia for the June 2017 NotPetya malware attack that caused billions of dollars in damages across the world. This represents a renewed effort by the US and its allies to publicly attribute states' actions that violate the emerging norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Also in February, the Justice Department indicted 13 Russians and 3 companies for their online efforts to interfere in the 2016 US presidential elections. In July, the Department of Justice announced the indictments of 12 Russian intelligence officers for carrying out large-scale cyber operations against the Democratic Party in advance of the 2016 presidential election. The officers' crimes included theft and subsequent leakage of emails from the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton campaign, and the targeting of election infrastructure and local election officials in an attempt to interfere with the election. And in October, the U.S. Justice Department announced criminal charges against 7 GRU officers for multiple instances of hacking against organizations including FIFA, Westinghouse Electric, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the U.S. and world anti-doping agencies. In April, the Director of the United Kingdom's Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, announced that the organization had been conducting offensive cyber operations against ISIS to suppress their propaganda, disrupt their coordination, and protect deployed military personnel. The U.S. has been conducting similar actions since 2016. In June of 2018, Chinese government hackers compromised the network of a U.S. Navy contractor, stealing 614 gigabytes of data related to weapons, sensor, and communication systems under development for U.S. submarines. The following October, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted Chinese intelligence officers and hackers for engaging in a campaign to hack into U.S. aerospace companies and steal information. And in December, the United States, in coordination with Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, accused China of conducting a 12-year campaign of cyber espionage targeting the intellectual property and trade secrets of companies across 12 countries. The announcement was tied to the indictment of 2 Chinese hackers associated with the campaign. In July, Singapore's largest healthcare institution, SingHealth, was targeted by state-sponsored hackers, leading to the leakage of personal information for 1.5 million patients, along with prescription details for 160,000 others. As a result, Singapore has begun to substantially accelerate its defensive cyber programs in both its civilian and military sectors. In October of 2018, the United States Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis announced that the U.S. would contribute its national offensive cyber capabilities to NATO alliance operations. This announcement mirrored similar announcements that Denmark, Estonia, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom had made throughout the previous year. NATO itself does not have organic offensive cyber capabilities and therefore relies on the voluntary contributions of its member states to provide necessary cyber effects during alliance operations.
Lessons learned. In analyzing the last 30 years of cyber conflict, Jay Healy identified 3 broad lessons. The first is that cyber conflict has only changed gradually over time, and thus, just as we see in historic analysis of battlefields in the kinetic domain, lessons derived from past cyber conflicts are still very relevant today. Unfortunately, these lessons are often ignored or forgotten. Prior to Mr. Healy's book, there simply was no easy source of knowledge covering the history of conflict in this domain. Another important factor is the massive influx of new entrants into the field. Each wave of new entrants, every 5 years or so, feels that they are the pioneers. Since they are not taught any history in their field, many accordingly fail to distinguish what is actually new versus what is simply new to them. The practitioners of cybersecurity have largely been technologists who see cyber conflicts as technical challenges. These technologists often fail to appreciate the different dynamics of how national security operates during cyber conflicts. On the other side of the coin, international security specialists just as often don't understand the complexities of cyberspace and have been told or mistakenly assume that since cyberspace is all new, their existing theories or approaches do not apply. Our authors Valeriano and Menes are the exception to this trend, choosing to apply traditional international relations models to cyber conflict. That is one of the reasons I chose these two books for this course, as they are complementary in their approaches to the problem of cyber conflict. Regardless, the disconnect between techno-geeks and policy wonks means that the overlap between these two perspectives is perpetually ignored. Finally, government and corporate secrecy also plays a key role in preventing the incorporation of lessons learned. Governments tend to classify breaches and intrusions, making it nearly impossible to gather and pass on important lessons. Corporations are just as guilty of this practice, often trying to hide even the existence of a compromise, lest their stock prices drop in response to an incident. J. Healy's observations mirror those of Villarano and Menes in noting that the probability and consequences of disruptive cyber attacks have been greatly overhyped. Healy points out that the real impact of cyber intrusions, such as cyber espionage, have been consistently underappreciated amidst this hype. While we have been worrying about cyber Pearl Harbors and cyber 9/11s, nation-state actors have been conducting what General Keith Alexander, former director of the NSA and former commander of U.S. Cyber Command, called the largest transfer of wealth in history. Alexander noted that the theft of intellectual property is astounding and we've got to stop it. The accumulated effects of cyber espionage, especially when such espionage is focused on the theft of intellectual property, is potentially far more damaging in the long term than some mythical cyber Pearl Harbor, as it directly affects the United States' ability to compete internationally from both an economic and military standpoint. Cyber espionage is to be ignored at our own peril. Laymen to this field often state that cyber conflict happens at the speed of light, or more accurately, two-thirds the speed of light when you consider actual network speeds that electrons travel in these mediums. While it is true that actions can happen with the click of a button, what is often missed is the days, weeks, months, or even years it takes an actor to develop tools, gather intelligence, and gain access to be able to click that button. Because strategically significant cyber conflicts tend to be part of larger geopolitical conflicts, their nature has tended to offer ample warning time to defenders. There have been no cyber Pearl Harbors. Nations are reluctant to conduct large-scale damaging attacks outside of traditional geopolitical conflicts. Healy's observations here again mirror those of Valeriano and Menas. Perhaps the biggest difference between cyber conflict and their traditional equivalents is one of the most often overlooked. When defending against cyber conflicts, it is non-state actors, not states, which typically are decisive in cyber defense. Companies and volunteer groups have repeatedly used their knowledge to mitigate and prevail in most of the conflicts detailed throughout Healy's book. Only rarely are governments able to bring the superior resources of their unwieldy bureaucracies to bear in enough time to decisively defend against attacks. Future implications. It is fairly obvious that as information technology continues to become more pervasive and ubiquitous, cyber conflicts will also increase. That being said, the trend continues to favor low-level operations such as cyber espionage. This parallels the research done by Valeriano and Menes, which suggests the same. Outside of kinetic conflicts, we are unlikely to see disruptive cyber attacks by nation-states. We will continue to see increasingly important participation by the private sector, both in terms of defense and investigations, along with capabilities development and commercialization. As this technology continues to spread, it is likely that non-state actors will pursue more disruptive means of cyber attacks. While we have not seen any successful cyber terrorist attacks, it is certainly not due to a lack of desire on the part of violent extremist organizations, and malware technology is much easier to obtain than weapons of mass destruction. Finally, we will continue to see increasing covert activity and use of proxies by states. Cyber operations allow states to effectively compete short of open warfare and will thus become an increasingly important capability. The good news is that policymakers, not just in the United States but throughout the world, are starting to understand the significance of cyber conflict and the important role this domain will play in national security and international relations. Finally, non-state actors such as hacktivists, cyber militias, and corporations will play an increasingly significant role in future cyber conflicts. Security firms like Mandiant, Kaspersky, and McAfee have already contributed immensely through investigations and publication of evidence and reports on significant cyber conflict events. Some corporations, such as Google, have pushed back against state actors that violate norms or conduct breaches on private systems. Security practitioners have been instrumental in returning systems to secure states after intrusions. These trends are likely to continue and grow in the future. Conclusions. It is critically important that we know and understand the history of cyber conflict. Lessons learned in the past are highly relevant to current and future problems. These lessons have been consistently ignored or forgotten as each new generation of cyber warriors assumes the helm. Just as past conflicts are studied in the other warfighting domains, so do we need to study and learn from the events in this domain. This is Professor Scott Applegate. I hope you have enjoyed this lesson on the brief history of cyber conflict. Please feel free to contact me if you have any specific questions in regards to this lecture.